Welcome to the Life Unscripted Podcast with Rosabel, the place where genuine conversations meet inspiring stories, personal growth, and a dash of humor. I'm Rosabel, your host, inviting you to embrace life's unpredictable journey. Celebrate your unique story and find joy in everyday moments. Get comfortable, stay curious, and let's explore together. Unscripted, unapologetic, and unstoppable. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Life Unscripted Podcast. I'm your host, Rosabel Zohfeld, and today I have the honor, and of course you two listeners, to listen with Lorraine Connell. She is the visionary founder of Peers Not Fears LLC. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Hi, Lorraine. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing great. Great morning here. I'm so excited to see what we can unpack, what can unravel, talking about, what do you have to offer. You talk a lot about leadership development, organization empowerment, perhaps, but especially, is it your main audience is teens, right?
Yeah, 12 to 16 is my target audience. Yeah.
Wow. And so you have worked in the classroom for like 20 years, correct?
Yeah, I was a chemistry teacher in high school for about 20 years before I left teaching to embark on this journey.
Wow. That's amazing. So tell us a little bit more. I'll let you, how about let you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. I call myself a teen leadership coach or teen empowerment coach, but really what my goal is to guide and work with teens who are not often labeled as leaders to find their voice, develop their confidence, to become the kids that or the people that they were meant to be. It's very similar to the goal and the guidance that I myself needed as a teenager and even throughout my adult life. I really didn't see myself worthy of a leadership position. I wasn't, in my words, I wasn't popular enough. I wasn't athletic enough. I wasn't smart enough to step into what I thought was a very prestigious position. And even as an adult, where I was mom, I was teacher, I was coach, I was advisor to students, I didn't see myself as a leader because whenever I attempted to take on a leadership official titled role, there was somebody who was better than me. And so it just reconfirmed that message to me that I couldn't be a leader. And so I figured there had to be a better way. And I figured there must be a way that I could have shifted my perspective, had some guidance so that I knew that leadership was available to each and every one of us.
Wow. And with that in mind, it occurred to me, I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of myths about leadership. And one of the things I'm thinking is like, and perhaps this is a question that even myself, I question, are leaders born or are they made? What's...
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly part of the problem is that we believe, and because it's perpetuated in society, that leadership is a privilege and leadership is something that you either have or you don't have. But so many things that we believe we can't achieve, confidence, leadership, public speaking, they're all really just skills that we develop the more we practice. And so, yeah, one of the biggest myths, and I talk about 3 of them, is that leaders are born naturally leaders. But that's such a myth that if you put it in perspective of any other sport or activity, you wouldn't say the same thing, right? So if I am born a natural basketball athlete, then yeah, but I can still develop that skill. And not every individual is born with that basketball natural ability, but they work on it and they get better at it. So leadership is just the same thing. Some people definitely have leadership qualities that they're born with, and they're like just really easy on them. But there's a lot of skills for a leader. And the more you work on those skills, the better you become and the better leader you become. And that, for me, that myth really held me back. And I saw it holding a lot of students back when I was a teacher. And so I really try and reframe that concept in the fact that
Yes.
it's something you can build.
Right. And like in anything in life, the opposite I believe is true. The opposite will be like when I encounter people say, "Oh, you're really good at this." And yeah, they might be, and that might be something you're born for this, but then what if that person actually doesn't have an interest? They might be good at it, but I'm like, no, I think I'm gonna pursue something different, which is okay, because I think that's where the difference is. Like, we shouldn't be saying not everybody was born to be a leader. Perhaps not everybody wants to be a leader. That's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
perhaps
And
what it
and
should be.
that's really what it comes down to is like I kind of wanted to be a leader, right? I was like, I
Right.
had these interests, but I didn't have somebody say, yes, Lorraine, you can be a leader, because I thought you had to have all of these things in place before you could be deemed a leader. And so went through my entire life thinking that I wasn't a leader, even though I and every individual person, there's only one requirement to being a leader, and that's making a decision. And so I'm making decisions on the daily, multiple times a day. So I am a leader. I'm always guiding myself in a direction, which is what leading is taking someone or something in a direction. Every time I make a decision, I'm going in a direction. And so that is the only requirement. So we're all already leaders. It's how far do we want
That
to
is
go
true.
in developing that leadership skill?
That is exactly right. And on that note, what inspired the name? What is it like Peers Not Fears? Tell me about
Oh,
that.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I don't think I get to talk about this enough. I think in schools, so often we're fearful. We're walking around, we're worried about what other people think of us. We're worried about if we're going to say the wrong thing. We're worried about how people think we are in terms of our intellect. And so we operate from this place of fear. And if we shift that mindset to being we are a community and we are peers to help each other, then there's this space for us to develop as leaders, a space for us to develop as individuals. And I just think, if we think about our community in schools as peers, then the fear
That
will
is
go away.
that is beautiful. And let me tell you something I thought along those lines. What you describe that happens in schools, and I think this is why I love talking about what you do. What you just described also happens in other areas. For example, it happens at work.
Mhm.
But if we tackle that right at the beginning in the formation period, like when you are actually in school and those teens years, right when you are getting ready to become or to give that next step to what's going to be your life, or how are you going to prepare yourself to go into the work or whatever it is that you want to do, as far as a career or anything like that, it will be so much easier because I encounter that at work. I can see so many people, like you say, and they're adults. They're like, we're
Mhm.
talking 50s, 60s, and they're afraid of what their boss might think, what they have these ideas, but they don't even want to bring them to the table because what are they going to think about me? What about this? What about that? And that is just such, oh my goodness, to break that cycle, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, and I really like there's a reason why I target 16 as my top age. I mean, I can work with anyone at any
right.
age, like you just said, but at 16, there's this thing that really shifts for teenagers and kids in general is all of a sudden they have this belief that they need to know what the rest of their life is going to look like. And so that they
That's
can
exactly
plan
right.
for the rest of their life, starting at that, junior year in high school, which some is about 16. They're starting to
Right.
drive. They're like, they have to pick a college, they have to pick a major. And so all of these decisions, and remember, leaders make decisions, like they come at these kiddos who haven't learned that there's no right or wrong decision. They really do think that if they don't make the right decision about what they want to do for the rest of their life, or they don't make the right decision about where they're going to college, that, and I'm not being dramatic, that their life is about to end.
Right.
And so
Absolutely.
it's this pressure because then they haven't developed the skill of knowing that there is no right or wrong decision. It's just the next decision. And I don't think I even knew that really until I started in my podcast. I interview adults who share their teenage journeys. And in those conversations, most of my guests realize I'm doing the work I'm doing right now because of that decision I made in high school that I thought was the wrong decision. And it's so important for parents, teachers, guidance counselors, especially our teenagers, to know there is no right or wrong decision when you are 16. It's just the next decision. And if anybody is ever questioning that, take a listen to any one of the episodes of Leaders of Today, and you'll hear from incredible leaders who are doing incredible work, who were messed up as a teenager, who didn't see themselves as confident, who were doing the wrong things as teenagers, and now they're incredible leaders. And I think there's so much to the fact that we live in fear of doing the wrong thing and making the wrong decision, that we perpetuate that myth throughout our entire lives. And that message is being sent to our teens.
Right. And then so it's I think I read on your website that you talk about mistakes being central of your curriculum. Can you develop a little bit more into that? I know you touched some of it, but tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting for me as a former educator to consider how I treated mistakes in my classroom, right? And I wasn't doing this intentionally, but as a teacher, I would shift my lesson on the fly because I had planned for all of these contingencies, but I never shared any of that with my students. So they saw me as being perfect, right? I never said, oh, shoot, I didn't think about that. Let me do this because I thought about that. Or, like just accept the responsibility and acknowledge that I made a mistake in my planning and I was shifting. And then I realized that if a student made a mistake, especially on a test or a quiz, I marked it wrong. Like, so the only real feedback that they got was that their mistakes were a big X, and that X then translated into a decrease in their grades. So again, mistake, X, decreased grade means it's bad. And so there's just this constant messaging in school that you cannot make a mistake. And then even we think about, what are we celebrating for our students? We celebrate the top of the class, the valedictorian. That person makes the least amount of mistakes. So we are celebrating not making mistakes, which is really problematic for all of us, right? And so maybe you're not a perfectionist, but you are sent this message that mistakes are bad. And then let's talk about our student leaders. If a student leader who is given a title, we'll call them the class captain or the class president or the soccer captain, if that individual student makes a mistake, and teenagers make mistakes all the time, they make bad decisions all the time. Let's say a student leader is caught at a party that has alcohol. what happens to that student leader? I mean, they all kind of get in trouble, parents decide, but that student leader has so many more consequences. They are removed from their sports. They are taken off that pedestal that we put them on as a student leader. You know, they are made an example because they're a role model, and we don't want any other student to know that this is an acceptable behavior. But that individual student is put in this position of, oh no, I made a mistake and I lost everything. And the message that we think we're sending is don't make mistakes to every other student. And they internalize that and say, I know I make mistakes. If that kid who is a student leader made a mistake, how can I possibly step into student leadership? Because I already know I make mistakes. So this messaging is everywhere. But if we don't make mistakes, then we're perfect. And we aren't perfect.
Yes.
And so it's this real challenge to navigate.
It brought me to also thinking my teens, and the expectation when you're a good student, and let's say, for example, I was a real good student and everything, but there was a time that something was going on in my house. There was difficulties, and I have this, down, and instead of and to that fear, that expectation, oh my God, I just, but it seemed like nobody stopped to care about what was going on. It was just like, oh, move on. Here comes so and so who's gonna replace you, who's gonna be now level, it's gonna be number one in the class. Okay, you're not longer, and then you just left field to figure out what to do for your own self, whether if you have the enough motivation to keep on fighting for being number one in the class or whatever it is. And one of the things I did like, though, and you mentioned this earlier, how we tend to celebrate, again, the good students, all these great achievements. But what about celebrating the fact, which I am very happy for, let me tell you why, because when I graduated high school, I was actually giving a little award for overcoming, which I was happy about that. So in other words, they, in a way, it was kind of funny because they're like, yeah, we recognize that at one point you were doing really good. You kind of went down and you kind of came back up. You may not be here now, but yeah, so I was like, okay, I feel better. I'm glad that they did that because they recognize that, okay, I work hard to try to, but that doesn't happen very often. Sometimes students are left behind, and like, you're not number one anymore. Like you said, make an example of you and life goes on. And then those scars are forever, they're with you.
Yeah. It's something that it becomes our identity. And also I think about that one position at the top, one position, which makes you and the 5 or 10 other people who are competing literally compete for that top position, rather than, if we stripped away that competition, think how much better and more incredible your journey would have been if you and those 10 other students were collaborating and celebrating and lifting each other up. There's so much more to be gained and valued. And as you move into your work and your future positions, you're seeing leadership, you're seeing success as a collaboration as opposed to a competition, which I think so many of us feel it's a competition.
Yes, and it's not good to feel in that way. And when I think about it, the faces, and it's been like, wow, how many years? Like 25 years, however many years it's been since I graduated. All the faces that come to, it's the number one, the one who went to do this, the one who went to do that. But it's so interesting what ends happening when actually real life comes about. So let's just put it this way, not for about. So the number one student, the one that was number one, it was doing super great. they're doing something completely different today. And the person that was regarded as, well, they're not gonna perhaps amount to nothing, they're doing excellent, even better, where people are like, wow, huh,
Yeah.
who 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 would have thought that, right? But again, it's because we are not paying attention. We're not
Yeah.
paying attention.
And the other thing that's really fascinating to think about is that middle student who worked really, really hard to get those grades actually experienced failure, experienced setbacks, experienced making mistakes, and learned how to accommodate and learned how to like persevere beyond them. Where the person at the top was like, I can't make a single mistake. So when life throws them a curveball and they have something that is deemed a failure or a mistake, they have no resources on how to navigate that. And that's why so often our valedictorian, our top of the class, get to college and face failure and mistakes, and they just crumble under the pressure. They have never experienced that.
Wow. You want to hear something kind of funny and interesting also? Uh, so that actually happened to me. So, um, I was born in Colombia, South America, and English is not the first language, of course, it's Spanish, right? And so we learned a little tiny bit of English throughout, and I was doing really great, but English was my worst topic whatsoever. I think I failed it actually. But to think today, I failed English. I was criticized. So I was convinced in my mind I would never ever. English was just like I don't know, like an elective or something. And to think that today I'm bilingual and I can have a conversation fully in English, it just like blows my mind. It's
Well,
unbelievable. And
and
I
it,
used to,
it
yeah,
when you share that, I think of my experience with languages and how, like, I only had to get this far in speaking another
yes,
language. And it was not, and for, like you said, an elective, but it's not a need in most of, like, in America, it's not a need to speak another language, but so many people come to America and they have to. And so it's
right.
just really interesting that you put that perspective out there, is like, you had to, it wasn't really that elective was a nice to have, and then it became a necessity. And
A
now look at what you
necessity.
can do with that language.
Exactly, exactly. That's just so funny. But yeah, I remember because there were a couple that, oh my, they were so perfect. And the teacher, he was like, oh, like, don't even speak, Rosabel. Whatever. I was just, and I was like, okay, fine. Never in my in a million years I thought I would be here in America and I'd be speaking English as a second language. Like, that's
Right.
interesting. Anyway, so let's talk about success stories. Perhaps the student that who transform after participating in Peers Not Fears.
Yeah, I actually just released a book that's called A Teacher's Story: How One Act of Leadership Inspired Many. And in that book are 15 different stories of students who are, in my vision, successful. And so many of those students, it was the fact that somebody saw something in them and told them that they could be a leader that transformed their belief about leadership. And the stories in there are really how they taught me what leadership was. I think of kids who are labeled class clowns, right? They're just looking for attention. They're looking for somebody. You, huh? Okay. They're looking for a stage. And what, as a teacher, I can do is give them an opportunity to be part of the performance of teaching. And when I open that door and ask them to join me, they're no longer disrupting the class. They're collaborators and they're connecting with me and their students or their peers. And I think of the student who is labeled a disruption, the kid who doesn't want to do anything, the kid who just sits back. chances are that kid doesn't feel successful in that class. And so they are putting up a mask that prevents them from engaging in the classroom. So if you're reaching out and having a conversation with that kid about how you can support them and guide them, then they feel seen, they feel heard, and they feel like they matter. And so I'm working in 2 schools right now. One school, I have, very interestingly enough, a group of introverted student leaders, and they would never have stood up in front of a group and spoken. They never would have even raised their hand in a class. And they just did a conference in front of a bunch of school administrators and shared some of the lessons that they have learned. I came back to the school and we were working on helping them integrate into other classes. And I got some feedback from the educators that these students are doing all of this leadership work, but they don't see these kids being leaders in their classrooms. And so it's this misunderstanding of what leadership is. We have this idea that a leader is somebody who is super confident and they are able to command the space and they can get a group to do something. But there's all sorts of leadership. And these kids who didn't stand up and command an audience, they stood up and they had a conversation with a group of school administrators. The teachers didn't see this, but their perception of what a student should look like as a leader needs to be adjusted. I see so much growth in these students. And so that's like, it's a success, but it's also like, oh, I didn't think that was success. So how do we reframe that? And then there's another school that I'm in. I'm working with a group of 7th graders, and these are, we'll call them our bad kids, right? Like, so they get sent out of class, they get in trouble all the time. And in the first session, they just stared at me. You know, they were like, what are you asking me to do? And I was asking them to play a team building game with me or a team building activity, because that's how you bring a teenager in, right? You're going to play a game with me. I'm not going to lecture at you. And so the first session, they just stared at me. The second session, they started, giggling and like rolling their eyes and shouting, I don't want to do this. And like, this is dumb. And then I realized it's because I was asking them to step into their challenge zone, a place where they often in classes are in trouble for doing, and so I had to share with them, unless you're hurting somebody mentally, physically, or emotionally, you're allowed to behave the way you're behaving, because when we are in our panic zone, we are in fight, flight, or freeze. And I'm asking you not to go so far out into your panic zone, but step into your challenge zone. And so the third session was really incredible, because after I had shared with them, they weren't going to get in trouble for these typical bad behaviors. They started to try, and they realized that they weren't going to get in trouble, and they tried again. And they learned that even though they couldn't succeed at the game or the solution to the activity, they were building connections with other people in the room, and they were feeling a little more confident. And then they became a little more courageous. And as you continue to build that momentum, they're willing to take a different kind of risk, not the risk that's going to get them in trouble, but the risk that's going to maybe get them seen in a different way, which is extremely vulnerable for a lot of kids. And so it's about working through these different levels of leadership and bringing them in. And I often say our kids who are labeled bad are probably our strongest leaders. They're just leading the group in a wrong direction, what we expect them to do. So if we can redirect them and bring them into our community of leadership and learning, then all of a sudden the way they're leading people is more in a more positive and connected way. So it's pretty cool.
Right. And so you said the word the kids that get labeled bad or whatever, because when we talk about this, we perhaps think about negative. But let me just give you a little example, and I like to give you my example. In my case, like I mentioned, I thought, well, maybe a class clown, but he all the way to college. But my issue was this: my parents, both of my parents were teachers, right? And I consider an avid reader. I was always reading, so I will be the one that would read. Literally, nobody told me to read the entire book, but I read it because I just love reading, right? And so I was so excited. I have all these questions, and I'll come, and it was all the way to college. So I was like, and I was always the one asking questions and answering. And so one day the teacher said, "Okay, everybody, Rosabel, I know you read the entire book, but please, everybody." And so what that did to me was like, oh, okay, I'm not supposed to speak. I'm not supposed to. So I just kind of went in my little, and then what I started adopting was more like, I'm not, it was not like, it was a sensation that my input, is not welcome. I get it. Maybe I needed somebody who could approach me and say, hey, we just want to give it an opportunity, but still, So what I did is I was not longer the disruptor, but again, my disruptions were like, I know. And I wanted to kind of always be there. And that just went away pretty quick because I just shut it down. And I'm like, well, so that kind of like what you're saying, it could cause someone to just, not be able to, like you say, communicate to, okay, I'm just gonna be here, I'm just gonna do my minimum, and that's it.
It's really interesting for me to hear those stories. You're not alone in that. And every teacher, fortunately and unfortunately, says something that is interpreted in the student's point of view as something negative. And I hear these stories and I think about, I know that I did that. I know that I said something, and I'm going to say this, if you have anybody as parents and teachers, we're going to say those things, and you're never going to know the impact that you have on a student or your child. But the best thing you can always do is, if you feel like you spoke out of turn, or you said that to your student who was like Rosabel, who raised her hand and was so eager, and you said, okay, we need somebody else to share. Like, if you reflect later and you say, gosh, I wonder how that was received by Rosabel, you have the chance to just reach out and say, hey, I know I shut you down in class, but I think what you offer is so valuable. I just don't want you to offer it as the first thing. I want some of the other kids to hear what they have, and maybe giving you a different opportunity. Making repair, acknowledging that we may have said something that had an impact on somebody else. And so often, it's so interesting for me because I think about how, we're like, well, just speak up. Why didn't you say something? And it's like, because they're the kids, right? They're like, oh, I must have done something wrong. And so it's our job as the adults and the teachers and the parents to say anytime, I'm sorry for that. And I really appreciate you. And just shifting that message and making that repair allows that student to know that you saw the impact. And if you do that in a way that allows other people to see that, then other kids might actually feel comfortable saying something. But it really is interesting that every teacher has this incredible power, and we don't realize it. We do and we don't. Like, we know that we can lift this kid to this beautiful place, but we don't think about we have the same exact influence on putting a kid down into this deep, dark hole, because that makes us feel bad. It's not about feeling good or feeling bad. It's about acknowledging our impact and acknowledging our relationship with our students.
Yeah, because what I can remember from that interaction is from that moment on, I never ever again participated. I never asked any question. I mean, I don't remember. And that was it. And that allowed me to graduate. I was actually in nursing school, and life wasn't fun anymore. I just graduated, and that that person of me kind of died there. That was it. That
Yeah.
was the end of it. There's no more. I don't remember anything exciting after that. I
Oh,
just kept reading, doing my things on my own, and that was it. I mean, it worked.
yeah.
It worked. She told me to. Okay, all right, it worked. But
Yeah,
let's
it's so interesting.
yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that story because I think those stories are not rare. And I know that that teacher had all the best intentions. It wasn't
Yes,
intended to shut you down forever, but we have that much influence in our students.
I
And
think it was more the comment like, well, I know you read the book, like you're being. It was more
dismissive.
like, well, you're doing some, so well, I will tell you this. I kept reading, I kept doing, but I was just, it was more like, oh, to me, my mind interpreted, okay, so it seems to be that this is something I gotta keep to myself. Good to
Mhm.
be you. And that was the message, to be honest with you. I feel like I got throughout my whole, it's like, hey, yeah, good to be you. And great that you know how to read, speed read, or do all this wonderful thing, that you have all these great ideas, but we're not interested in here. And so, yeah, keep on going. Yeah, go to graduate. I did. Yeah, okay, good. All right, let's go to work. And that's it. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so maybe that's why I have a podcast today.
Maybe.
So I can just be free and say the things I want to say in a very respectful
Yeah.
manner, and just forgive. Which, by the way, because you know what my nickname was when I was a kid? The radio.
That's awesome.
Because I wouldn't shut up, and my 4-year-old is the same way. So you have to canalize, you have to channel those things, because otherwise you're going to grow to be a frustrated person to whatever. And so now I'm in
Mm.
my happy place. I'm able to speak. It's my safe place. We have conversations, and that's why I call it unscripted.
I love it. I love it.
Yes. And so I feel very, very happy to do this. Anyway, so I want to ask you, for parents though, for
Mm.
parents out there that are concerned about their kids, let's see, their self-confidence, what are some practical steps that they can take home and to help reinforce,
Yeah, I
what you
think
teach?
the one of the biggest things that I want parents to hear, because I needed to know, and is try not to label the child, label the behavior. You're acting shy. You're being shy in this situation rather than you're so shy, right? There's a slight distinction. Um, really quiet kid, like you're behaving in a quiet way. Maybe that's because you're learning something, or maybe because you're observing what other people are doing. Our quiet, shy kiddos are our best observers, and they bring such an incredible value. But parents, this is a skill that they develop. So do not assume that if your child is not a good public speaker, or your child is not good in group settings, or your child can't lead the way you think that they should lead, giving them opportunities to practice in little steps, right? So if I know my kid has to do a presentation for his class, it's really interesting to me as I look back on, how often we as teachers like just say, okay, well, you're going to present your information, because we know that this is a skill that we want our kids to be able to do, but we don't acknowledge that everybody is at a different place on being able to do that. So if I'm a parent and I know my kid comes home and they're panicking because they know they have to stand up and give a presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, start with just me. Give me the presentation. Or if that's even still really hard for my child, do it in front of the mirror. Do it for yourself. Okay. Now do it for a different one person. And then after you've done that, then add a couple other comfortable people, your father and your siblings, right? They're going to be kind of silly and they're probably not going to listen as well as your class, or, maybe they won't, but you're giving them the tool to start with where they are comfortable and then giving them a little challenge. But if you don't provide those skills, you're basically taking your child who is like not able to do it at all, and you're putting them in the worst case scenario. I mean, we do that as teachers all the time, and we don't acknowledge that challenge. But as a parent, if the teacher is not providing that scaffolding, you can do it at home. If you want your kid to start to be able to talk to adults, start with somebody that they are comfortable with and give them some prompts. Okay, go talk to your Nana about this thing. Here's a question that you can ask your Nana. Now, what if you are going to go and you're going to ask somebody at the store? Oh my God, no way. I can't do that, Mom. Okay, well, let's do it together, right? You can watch me, I will model, and then the next time you're going to do it. And then the third time you're going to do it, and I'll be standing back in the next aisle, right? So we're giving them short bits of steps that is achievable, but don't assume that they can't. Give them the opportunity. And if they say there's no way, then say, okay, well, what would you be comfortable doing? And practicing. The more you practice something, think of basketball. If you can think of any sport, what do they do to get better? They practice. They have a coach. They do it again. They put it into a game-like situation. They have the game, and then they go back and they learn from their lessons. And so if we just see all of these challenges our kids are facing and say, all right, let's practice, then it takes the game-like situation out of the equation, because we're not going right to the game. So anytime you're faced with a challenge where your kid is like, no way, understand that that's probably because we're putting them in a game without any practice. How can you build in some practice? And I have a lot of resources on my website for different things that we can do with our kids. One of my favorite things to do with families is talk about the zones of comfort. Like, what is easy for you may not be easy for your kid, right? So I think about math, right? Math is like a no-brainer for me. But one of my children or one of my kids struggles with math. And so I look at him and I'm like, how could you not understand this? Well, that's because we're in different places on our zones of comfort. And so it's just really recognizing that and building the skills and helping scaffold them into the game time situation.
Wow. That is incredible. That's good tips out there for parents. Now, Peers Not Fears has definitely grown, impressively, or what I can see. What's next? What's next in the horizon?
Okay, so 2020, I said I was going to write a book, and in 2025, I wrote that book, and that was really, really exciting. I think what's next for me is really trying to make this available for all kids in a way that is achievable. And so I did that with my workbook. So if your school is not building leadership for kids in the school for all kids, the workbook is a really great resource for any parent. Will I find myself on a TED Talk? I think that could be really cool, and a way for me to sort of share this message that it's not a triangle where the leader is at the top. A real leadership structure is the inverted triangle, where we all start at the top and we're working our way down together. And for me, that's what's really beautiful about this work, is that it's totally doable for everybody. And a leader who is not trying is not developing. And I don't want to work for a leader who's not going to continue to develop. Yeah, that's what's next for me, I think, is like trying to get this message into the hands of as many people as possible.
And I want to ask, how can listeners get involved, whether it's volunteers, sponsors, advocates for teens leadership?
Yeah, I love working with people who see the value of the student and the teenager voice. I think they have such incredible power and their minds think so differently than ours. Engaging them in the conversation. If you reach out on Instagram or even LinkedIn and let me know that you value the voice of students, then we can find a way to connect and find an opportunity to lift their voices together. And I'm Peers Not Fears at most social media platforms. On LinkedIn, I'm Lorraine Connell. And I really love thinking about leadership in different ways. So if you want to have a conversation about leadership and you are now starting to challenge your beliefs about what you think about leadership, reach out and let me know what you're thinking, because chances are you're going to bring something to the table that I hadn't thought of, and it's going to spark a new idea in the work that we're doing.
So listeners can go to your website, which is,
Yeah.
remind us again.
Yeah, it's peers-not-fears.com.
Oh, okay. And yeah, because I was on your website, and when you go in there, you have different things you can select, and there's also all the social media buttons that you can click in, right, to go in.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Um, let's see. Yeah, I wanted to ask you that. Now, yeah, again, yeah, you'll find the links there. Well, is there anything I have not asked you that perhaps you wanted to talk about?
No, but I think I never really addressed what the 3 myths of leadership are. And so I do want to make sure that we all hear those so that we
Okay.
know when we're thinking them. So leaders are not born. It's a skill we develop. That's the one that we did talk about. Leaders are not perfect. Unfortunately, many people believe, and that again goes back to that mistake challenge, that leaders are perfect and they don't make mistakes. If you are a leader and you don't acknowledge your mistakes, then you're telling the rest of your team that they can't make mistakes. And mistakes are going to happen. If you don't want to find out that mistake 2 months later when, your numbers aren't working or your products didn't get out the right way, it needs to start with you. You need to acknowledge and accept your own responsibility when you make a mistake. And that's really hard. It was hard for me as a mom. It was hard for me as a teacher. We love feeling like a superhero for our kids. But like at some point, we are no longer this incredible superhero. And if we make a mistake and we don't acknowledge it with our kids, we're sending them a message that they can't tell us when they make a mistake. So leaders are not perfect. We make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. And then the third myth is that leaders need a title. And that was the thing that stopped me from seeing myself as a leader, because when I tried to get a position that had a leadership title, I didn't get it. So that message was, you're not a leader, but that's not true. We are all making decisions every day. And that's the only requirement to being a leader. Everything else is you're developing to be a better leader and a more efficient leader. So continue to work on the other skills that make you a good leader.
That's awesome. Now, since you were talking about this myth, and I don't know, I want to ask you something. I don't know, maybe it is related because perhaps involves leadership. What would you say, like if perhaps someone, and this is, I'm not sure this applies to the teens, but a work situation where you go to, whether it's your boss or somebody that it's again, someone who's above you in a way, and you say, I'm feeling frustrated because I'm going through this situation, and they said, well, no, just they give you good advice, say, yeah, you should do this, and by the way, about the other stuff, we're not going to change that. That's the way it's going to be. We can't do anything about it. So in other words, move on, do what you can, and don't worry because that's not going to change. how is somebody supposed to feel when we hear that? I mean, have you heard that?
Yeah, I think everyone is a case by case basis, but I think if you're courageous enough to bring an idea to somebody who is above you and they're not willing to listen, then I think it's an indication that maybe your values are not aligned. And we're not always in an opportunity where we can shift or change jobs or situations. But if your values are not aligned with the person who is above you, then you're going to continue to feel that way. You're going to continue to feel frustrated and you're going to continue to feel conflict. And unless you want to change, it's probably not going to get better. So what are some things that you can do? You can figure out a way to make it work within your environment, or you can start to think about what else is out there for me. And I'm not going to tell you one way or another, but I think the best thing is to recognize that if you have the courage to bring an idea to a leader and that leader is not willing or able to listen to your ideas or even just acknowledge them, then your values are not aligned. And it may be just the challenge that you have to navigate, or you can make a change.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've heard that many times. And I think in general, what happens in this kind of situations is you're right. You can make a change, but unfortunately, one of the things I've seen and I continue to see is then this whole silent quitting comes in. I don't know if you heard that term. And when you're like, okay, well, I'm just gonna do, what I'm asked to, my bare minimum. But once again, you don't want to find yourself in a situation. And if you think about it, and I'm just connecting it goes back to that interaction that I had with my teacher. Hey, and okay, so I'm just gonna shut myself down. I don't do the best, and I'm just gonna be average. I'm just gonna do what everybody else does. I'm not gonna care so much about this, that, until you either decide to leave the place, make a change, and so on. And that's kind of like how life goes. But it's a very interesting. I know it's probably a conversation for another day, but it's just food for thought out there for someone who
Well,
perhaps might be
and
listening.
just because somebody has a title as a leader doesn't mean they're a good leader. And that's the thing that I have learned along the way is that, one, that doesn't make them a good leader to just put them in a position. And two, we're not really giving leaders any training on how to be good leaders. So
That's exactly what
if
I was
I'm a
gonna
good
say.
teacher, I become an administrator and now I'm just like, it doesn't make me a good administrator because I was a good teacher. And so
One thing,
having
yes, one of the things I wanted to say this, that I've noticed when it comes to leadership positions in the different places that I've been, is that leaders are chosen not because, again, they were getting the education or because they wanted to be leaders. It's because, you've been here 20 years, therefore
Yeah,
somehow that gives you okay, so you get to move on. And often these so-called leaders, they don't even understand what the people under them do. And that
right.
right there is one of the main problems. And then you have perhaps someone like me who's like, hey, but I see this, and then they're like, yeah, we see that what you see, this has been going on, but we're like, now everybody's working. We're like, yeah, it's just going on for 40 years. We're not gonna fix this. And I'm
Mm,
like, but hello. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm just gonna go in my little
yeah.
thing. And then, or I decide to grow up my YouTube channel, whatever, and then here I am.
Right. I mean, and that's the thing, at this point in our lives, like we do have a lot to offer. And if we're not
Yes,
being able to share what we have to offer, then it's time for us to find a way to be able to offer that. It may
it's
not be at
time.
work.
Yes, it's time to
Find
find our
another
audience.
way.
The audience that we resonate with, the people who actually are interested in listening our voices. And so I
Yeah.
think
And
that,
I think
again,
everybody's voice matters. And that's the underlying theme of my work is that, when you feel like your voice doesn't matter, then you don't use it, but it does matter and we need to hear it.
Absolutely. So I want to thank you so much for what you're doing, especially with the teens, because again, it's kind of like in childhood or when you have a baby, when you have education begins then at the beginning,
Yes.
not when you're out there like in your, well, let's see, now we're going to figure out how we're going to be leaders. Well, that's something you could have learned earlier. So thank you so much because
Yes.
there's not a lot of people out there doing what you do. I mean, you hear a
No.
lot about leadership at work and that, but I mean, uh, I don't see any teens working there. I'm just kidding. You
No,
know what I mean,
and it's
right?
really about that training, right? Like when we're going to
Right.
put somebody into a leadership position, they should really have some training because it's a trickle down.
Yes. So the more that we share this, the more people listen, and perhaps it starts a ripple effect where people are like, hey, maybe we need to think this in a different way. Maybe we need to start rethinking this whole process. And
I love
it's
that.
great. But thank you, Lorraine. Thank you so much for sharing your passion, your insights. I mean, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. I'll call everyone here listening to please connect with Lorraine. Go to her website, Peers-Not Fear, right? Not Fears, right?
Yeah, that fears. Yes. Yeah. And follow my podcast, Leaders of Today. I
Yes.
think you'll really enjoy those the conversations that we have there.
Thank you. I did not know you had a podcast. Maybe I know you mentioned here, but I had, I'm not, so I'm going to be listening because one thing I love is to listen to other podcasts to see what I can do better, how I can. So awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank
for being
you.
here with us today. Bye-bye.
I want to invite you, yes, you listening right now, to check out my book, The Courage to Succeed: A True American Dream. It is available now on Amazon and also Barnes & Noble. This is a story of resilience, grit, and what it really means to chase your dreams, even when the odds are stacked against you. If you ever face fear, failure, or uncertainty, this book will meet you right there and remind you that courage always has a voice. Just search The Courage to Succeed: A True American Dream by Rosabel Zohfeld on Amazon or head to the link in the show notes because your dream is worth it and your courage can take you there.